All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the second installment of the Online Olio, which is a series of webinars sponsored by the International Margaret Cavendish Society during the fall of 2020. E, do you want to turn off the chime? You can turn it off through participants, I think, if you're the host.
Thank you.
Sorry, but if not, that's fine. Anyway, for those of you who joined us last week to talk about insects and women naturalists of the 17th century, including Cavendish and also Maria, Sybil, and Marion, we're delighted to have you back. And to those of you who are joining for the first time this week, we're so glad you're here. My name is Sophia Richardson. I'm one of the co-organizers of this, along with Arno Zimmern and E. Spencer, and they'll be helping to moderate this session and keep things flowing. We're also grateful to have Laura Dodds and Marina Leslie, who will be helping to facilitate some of the breakout rooms later on this session. So our guiding questions for today, very roughly put, are what fancy is and what fancy does. Turning to our timeline for today. I'll get started with an introduction and a few words on Cavendish's earliest publication, Poems and Fancies. Then I'll introduce David Cunning to take us through the ontology of the imagination and the mobile and imagistic attributes of thoughts according to Cavendish. And finally, we have Maura Smyth to help us think about the crossover between fiction and philosophy in projects of world building and the challenges and opportunities this presents, particularly, but not exclusively, for women authors and readers. After our panelists, who I will introduce a bit more as we transition into their talks, we will, like we did last week, split up into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes. The screen share is not coming through. Huh, interesting. Okay, sorry, thanks guys. 1 second.
No, it was.
It was.
Yeah, we were able to see it.
Okay. I'm great at Zoom, guys. All right. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
I can't have everything open. All right. Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. So we'll do a breakout room for 20 minutes. We'll take a 5-minute break. We'll come back for a large group discussion with all of our panelists and participants, and we'll wrap up around 5. That's Eastern time or whatever time you are in. I don't have a beautiful slide like Arnaud did, but just a reminder, mute yourself so that we don't get background noise during the panelists. Please unmute yourself when we're doing the more interactive parts. Please feel free to use thumbs up, applause, go slower, whatever reactions are relevant. Please use the chat. I probably won't be able to look at everything, but we do have a chat moderator. So they'll jump in and let me know if something is horribly awry. And we'll remind you how to raise your hand for the large group discussion when we get to that. So my name is Sophia Richardson. Please feel free to call me Sophie, most people do. And I'm a 5th-year graduate student in the English department at Yale. I work primarily on early modern English verse and drama. And as to how I got started with Cavendish, my very first semester of grad school, I wrote a seminar paper on fashion in the blazing world for a 17th century course with John Rogers. And sorry, I'm getting slightly distracted by all the different things. Focusing. Okay, right. Fashion, blazing world. And then 5 years later, I somehow have still not quite extracted myself from Cavendish's clutches. And I think many of you here will be familiar with thinking that you're just about to wrap up with Cavendish and you go to double check one little detail for a footnote, and then somehow hundreds of pages by and about Cavendish later, you've spawned 5 new projects. And so I think we fall prey to this because Cavendish is a very associative and lateral thinker. And the more tightly she focuses in on a particular tiny niche, the more capacious it becomes somehow. And that phenomenon, that boundless and often unwieldy generativity, is in essence what we'll be looking at today throughout all of our talks and materials. So I'd like to start by taking you to the tiniest figure in Cavendish's catalog of fancies, and then demonstrating the scalar effect, whereby micro becomes macro, the trivial becomes pivotal, and fancy goes from being a tiny blip or bauble to proving itself the prime ground for vast world-building endeavors. So turning to what fancy is and what fancy does. I propose we first look at some of the poems from the body of Cavendish's 1653 Poems and Fancies to glean some core qualities of fancy, even as her renderings are, of course, varied and multiple, ranging from insects to fairies to ribbons, and hovering between nature and artifice. Subsequently, I'll turn back to some of the prefatory materials to the volume, where Cavendish offers some apologies and justifications that help further frame what it is that she thinks fancy does. I'm going to try the screen sharing one more time. Let's see if it works. The first portrait I'd like to offer is one of the least flattering. You may remember this poem from last week, in which we learned that fancy is like a gnat. If we picture fancy like a gnat, then for one thing, it's very tiny, like this poem, which is also quite small. And in a way, a gnat like fancy is rather fragile. It can, with very little force or forethought, be slapped out of existence by the hand of worldly cares. And yet, for something living in such precarity, it's surprisingly persistent. First, it buzzes all around the brain, then it stings, which then blisters and festers and burns. A bug bite is such a small injury, and yet, the itch of a well-placed insect bite can be infinitely aggravating. The remedy is to write. The pen lances the blister to draw out the fluid, which becomes ink, seeping into a sheet, which is at once a bandage and a page. Just as the gnat is all but invisible, yet has a galvanizing effect, so too is fancy a slight body with a vicious bite, painfully itching until scratched out on the page. So by symbolizing fancy to a gnat, we learn that fancy is annoying to a degree vastly incommensurate with its small size. In my next poem, The Prey of Thoughts, we learn that, where are you not going? There we go. We learn that while tiny on its own, fancy is part of a much larger ecosystem, as Cavendish taxonomizes different kinds of thoughts and characterizes their animalistic hunting and feeding techniques as she assembles a food chain for the fauna of the brain. Thoughts are the mind's creatures, and they behave in visceral, creaturely ways. Ambitious thoughts, for instance, are like hawks, circling the skies until they seize upon a clutch of young, hopeful thoughts, just like a real bird would snatch up baby partridges. And while ambitious thoughts soar through the skies, vain thoughts swim like fish in the sea. Vengeful and spiteful thoughts are feline hunters, while suspicion takes the form of a hound, tracking down the doubtful hare. So far, these are mostly examples of megafauna, but Cavendish turns back towards the tiny at the end, where she introduces the industrious ant-like thoughts of gratitude and the bee-like thoughts of lovers. If the poem had a next line, I imagine it would feature the gnat-like thoughts of fancies, who would buzz alongside the bees through the cognitive ecosystem of the brain as depicted here. Something you'll notice, though, is that although Cavendish gives us this whole animal kingdom, she's not interested in depicting real animals so much as she's interested in crafting similes. Cavendish's interest in this poetic Cavendish's interest in this poetic ecosystem is not so much that of the naturalist. It's something more like a very artistic anthropologist, sociologist fusion thing. When Cavendish thinks about the creatures of fancy, he's not just interested in instinct, but also in industry. Envisioning the gnat as a potential player in a whole mental ecosystem does some of the work of taking fancy out of isolation and positioning it in an interconnected, interdependent system, feeding on animals many times its size, and itself an important food source for birds and bats and beetles, I think. I don't know. Gnats are very useful for thinking about fancy in nature, but gnats don't make a lot of art. They don't build a lot of infrastructure. So as an alternative model for fancy, one that allows for cultural components, elements of artifice alongside the natural, Cavendish proposes fairies. Who knows? But that in every brain may dwell these creatures we call fairies. Who can tell? And by their several actions, they may make those forms and figures we for fancy take. Like gnats, fairies are tiny, presumably winged creatures in the brain. And again, like gnats, their figures may be almost imperceptible, but their effects are definitely palpable. The major difference is that while gnats buzz and bite, fairies build. Fairies are social creatures. They have merchants and marketplaces. And so we're able to collectively construct complex orders that we experience as dream visions, recollected memories, and spontaneous inventions. Fairies and gnats are similarly disruptive, but because of their wide-ranging industry, fairies cause a wider array of ailments. Dizziness caused by collapsing houses, headaches in response to new construction, toothaches attributed to the fairies' mining activities in our jaws. Gnats and fairies as alternate figures for fancy are importantly distinct in that gnats highlight the naturalness of fancy. They're an uncultivated, largely uncontrollable part of the natural world, while fairies foreground their art and industry. They have an economy, perhaps more than an ecosystem. A key point of commonality, though, is that both gnats and fairies are creatures of their own minds. That is, while they might be literally made of you, and they might be located in you, they don't work for you. And so a third formulation of fancy surfaces primarily in her preparatory materials, where Cavendish thinks through how an artist or author might harness fancy, so that it's not simply excavating or extracting raw material from her, but can be deliberately manipulated to work with her. He frequently returns to figures of threads, webs, and silk, which, as Sylvia Bowerbank argues, bridges the natural process of the silkworm or spider with the artful practice of the spinstress or needleworker. In this third iteration of fancy as thread work, Cavendish keeps with her portrayal of fancy as tiny. She actually first situates this smallness as a kind of apology. In the epistle to natural philosophers, Cavendish claims that while a number of her poems overtly engage with natural philosophical material, she's not trying for any sort of hefty treatise here. She's offering us delectable little morsels. She's continually emphasizing their trifling nature, almost negating them out of existence entirely. They are not thoroughly reasoned on, not to be accounted authentic. She had nothing better to do when she wrote them. We probably have nothing better to do than to read them. If they have errors, it's no great matter. There will be no harm done, nor time lost. Her errors aren't harmful, they're playful. She notes here that she's deliberately matched the verse form and fictional register to their function as pastime, showing the congruent thinness and tininess across form and function. My atoms will be as small as themselves. Although this looks like a modesty topos, the smallest of the work actually becomes its virtue, a specifically feminine virtue, as thinness turns into a manifestation of thrift. You should go read Laura Dodd's piece on that. Once again, through symbolizing, Cavendish argues that core housewifely duties of practicing good husbandry and thrift can be demonstrated in poetry through this resourceful and strategic use of fancy, just as one might thoughtfully manage provisions and resources on an estate. And the mark of a really skillful poetess, it turns out, is the fineness of her work, the very smallness that purportedly makes it a trivial little pastime, the thread drawn so small it is scarce perceived. So the very tininess that supposedly makes her atom poems so weightless and harmless is in fact also what makes them virtuous and serious. Through a similar paradoxical logic, the more artificial these works become, the more natural they are to women. Women, apparently, naturally tend to vanity. Vanity is the purview of many singular choices of clothes and ribbons and the like. And this decorative mode of dressing is but one manifestation of the way that women's brains work usually in a fantastical motion, which is to say they're inclined to fancy. Poetry, of course, is likewise built upon fancy, and so women may claim it as a work belonging most properly to themselves. With these prefaces, I brought us back to the very beginning of Poems and Fancies, but these fancies also mark an end. After Poems and Fancies and its companion volume, Philosophical Fancies, Cavendish never again releases a collection primarily of verse. She also makes a hard departure from the atomism that she tries out in Poems and Fancies in favor of the planist, vitalist materialism she develops later. My suspicion is that atoms and tiny verses are connected for Cavendish, that there's a material reason that these philosophical ideas take this form on the page. We might think about fancies as taking the shape of fleas or fairies or ribbons, but they're also, of course, shaped into little poems. Like earrings, they're decorative, pleasing little things. Like ribbons, they're interwoven with rhymes. These discrete little verse forms are well suited for portraying not just fleas and fairies, but also for formally enacting the atomic theory to which Cavendish devotes the whole first section of this volume. But although she moves away from atomism, and she moves away from fairies and the fancies in this form, fancy at large, the imaginative processes in the mind, remain incredibly important to Cavendish throughout her career. She switches form a little bit, but she doesn't renounce everything from poems and fancies. She's continually drawn to this idea that just because something seems really tiny and negligible from our perspective, that doesn't mean it wouldn't become a vast, complex, weighty world if we could simply shift perspective. The idea that the invisible, even the imaginary, can have real substantive effects, not just itching the brain, but chafing against political systems, legal limitations, social mores, as well, of course, as accounting for much of the perpetual change of the material universe. That idea only grows in conviction throughout Cavendish's works. And the notion that however small or domestic, frivolous, feminine a world may be, it is still a world, and that a limited compass is not a limit to complexity. We see the seed of that conviction in poems like these, and we see it blossom in The Blazing World, where Cavendish finally offers us these worlds and worlds and worlds. So David and Maura will take us through these last 2 points in greater detail, but keep in mind the smallness of her first fancies. The magnitude of Cavendish's visions are all the more impressive when you remember what tiny little bodies they grow from. So that's all from me. Thank you for your attention. I hope you have lots of thoughts and questions. But before we get to that, we have 2 more wonderful presentations. Next up is David Cunning. David is the chair of the philosophy department at the University of Iowa. Early students might know him as the author of the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Cavendish, which is quite useful if you're looking for a smart but digestible overview. He also works on Descartes, Spinoza, Malebranche, the mind-body problem, 17th century philosophy generally, how that connects to today. His list of publications is much too long to comfortably fit on a slide. So I'm just highlighting here 2 things that I thought might be interesting. There is this quite recent, sort of explanation of a lot of Cavendish's thoughts drawn from across her works that are sort of consolidated and explained in Margaret Cavendish Essential Writings. And then forthcoming is a piece on the feminist world of Margaret Cavendish, which seemed like it might be something that people in this room would enjoy knowing is coming up whenever presses continue pressing things. So there's a lot more to say, but I'm not going to for the sake of time. Instead, I am unsharing my screen, and David, I will hand things over to you.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and share my outline. Everybody see the outline? Is that coming up? Great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So I thought it would be fun to talk about Cavendish's larger materialism, in particular, some of her reasons for thinking that minds are material, physical entities. She's writing against the background of a tradition that rejects that view. There's so many folks who thought that bodies and physical things are one kind of thing, basically the stuff that's made out of the elements of the periodic table, right, that we have today, and that minds are very different. You know, Socrates and Plato had this view, Descartes had this view, a lot of the medieval tradition folks had this view. Minds are just very different kinds of things. Minds are not spatial. Minds are not visible. They can't be touched. They're not tangible. They're not the product of our brains in any sort of way. They're just made out of a different kind of stuff. And so Cavendish offers a bunch of I think, really clever arguments and reasons for thinking that our minds are material things. She's trying to really blow up this tradition that comes before her and that surrounds her. So one argument, these aren't in any particular order really. One argument is that Cavendish notices that minds move, or she asserts that minds move when we're on an airplane or something, right, going from one place to the other. We're thinking. If we end up in a different city, we're thinking in that city and our thoughts are now there as opposed to where they were at the start. Maybe she's traveling around in a carriage outside of London and her thought is traveling with her. She's thinking, well, wait a minute, the only things that are capable of motion are material things. Only things that can move are things that have a location and can move from place to place. So if minds move, they must be material themselves. So she says, for example, it's true that matter might subsist without motion, but not motion without matter, for there's no such thing as an immaterial motion. And so since minds move, they must be material things themselves. Then she says, she offers an example in which she mentions that our souls sometimes do move. But I think she takes that to be uncontroversial in this next passage. You'll note here that philosophers really wrestled with this problem at the time. There's a famous passage in Locke where he says, in the essay, where he says, yeah, when I'm going from London in my carriage, of course, my thoughts are traveling with me. And then he just drops the subject entirely and doesn't draw the conclusion that Cavendish does. One of his readers, one of his correspondents, picks up the theme in a letter to him, a guy named Stillingfleet, and says, oh, wait a minute, if you think minds travel, doesn't that mean you think they're physical? And doesn't that mean that we're just physical beings? And does that mean that animals can have thoughts if they're just physical beings? And everything just went berserk. And Locke responded, he said, oh, I'm going to hedge my bets. I don't know what to say here. But he's worried about certain theological implications of the view that human beings are just purely physical and that their minds are purely physical. Cavendish is happy to own the view and to say it explicitly. Another reason she has for thinking that minds are material things is that our minds seem to have a location in our body, and they seem to be connected to our bodies. So she says in Philosophical Letters, Madam, I would ask those that say that the brain has neither sense, reason, nor self-motion, therefore not perception or mind, but that all that proceeds from an immaterial principle as an incorporeal spirit distinct from the body. I'd fain ask them where their immaterial ideas reside, in what part or place of the body. If the mind has no dimension, how can it be confined in a material body? Here she's targeting folks like Descartes, who would say that our minds are connected to our bodies, and our minds can budge our bodies and make our bodies move, like when you choose for your arm to go up, when it goes up. Cavendish is basically saying, well, wait a minute, if our minds are connected or interface with our bodies, there'd have to be a point of contact, right? There'd have to be a way that they come into connection. So our minds would have to be physical as well. If our minds are immaterial, they could try to move our bodies, but they'd be like ghosts. They just go right through them or something. So Descartes had nothing really helpful to say here about how minds are immaterial and still connect to our bodies. Cavendish is trying to hold him accountable, say it's because minds are physical themselves. Another argument that Cavendish offers has quite a lot of background to it as well. What she argues is that, I'll just read the quote here. There was a common argument in the 17th century, which is that minds must be immaterial things. They can't be material or physical. And the argument is basically, if minds were material or physical, there'd have to be a way to explain how a bunch of bodies, like atoms or elements of the periodic table, whatever they're going to be, there has to be a way to explain how things like that could combine together and result in thought, right? And the idea is that atoms themselves don't have thoughts. They have features like atomic weight and atomic charge. But how could those things combine together and result in something like thinking? There's no way, a lot of folks in the 17th century thought, there's no way that thoughts are physical, because there's no way to explain how a bunch of atoms could combine together into something like a brain, then all of a sudden result in features like thought. All they could result in is just larger brains and larger sizes and shapes. So Leibniz has this famous argument. He says, we must confess that the perception and what depends on it is inexplicable in terms of mechanical physical reasons, that is through shapes and motions. If we imagine that there's a machine whose structure makes it think, sense, and have perceptions, we could conceive it enlarged. Maybe he's thinking about a brain here, keeping the same proportions so that we could enter into it as one enters into a mill, assuming that when inspecting its interior, we'll find only parts that push one another, and we'll never find anything to explain a perception. And Cavendish basically takes this argument and turns it on its head, and she says, Well, sure, right? You're right, Leibniz, if you think that matter at its most basic level consists of features like size and shape and motion, and that's it. But Cavendish says no, right? This is evidence actually that at its most basic level, matter thinks. The smallest bodies that we're going to encounter, they have life and perception and animation. The way she puts it is to say, I shall never be able to conceive how senseless and irrational unthinking atoms can produce sense and reason, or how a sensible and rational body such as the soul is. It's true different effects may proceed from one cause or principle, but there's no principle which is senseless can produce sensitive effects. And so here she's really putting her materialist view of mind front and center. She's saying that clearly our brains think, clearly our brains are connected to our minds, and our brains have thoughts. But that couldn't happen if the tiny molecules and atoms that composed our brains were just atoms that had features like size, shape, and motion. The only way to make sense of any of that would go is if the basic building blocks of the universe have thought and perception themselves. And so she thinks that there's mind everywhere, right, in all the bodies that surround us. So a consequence of this view, or she sees it as a consequence of her view, the view that minds are material and that matter thinks, is that thoughts are imagistic pictures. So somebody like Descartes, who thought that thoughts and minds are immaterial and non-physical, they would say that strictly speaking, thoughts are abstract. They don't involve sensory pictures. They would point to things like the idea we have of a perfectly straight line or a perfect circle, or an idea of God that can't be pictured, or an idea of the soul that Descartes would say can't be pictured. Descartes had the view that thoughts are not imagistic material pictures, but they're more abstract. Cavendish is going to say no, right? Minds are material and physical, and ideas themselves are physical pictures, just like a painting is a physical picture, but an idea is a physical picture. And so there's a number of passages where she fleshes this out. In one here in Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, she says, I take an idea to be the picture of some object, and there can be no picture without a perfect form. And then neither can I conceive how an immaterial can have a form not having a body. And then in these next couple of passages, you can just kind of skim them over. She's pointing out that even in the thoughts that we have that seem pretty abstract, where we think we're thinking something that doesn't involve a picture, she thinks we still are thinking a picture. So even in mathematical demonstrations or geometrical demonstrations, we may think we're thinking something like a perfectly straight line that we can't draw on paper, or that we couldn't really picture in thought, because no picture could ever be of an exactly straight line. There'd always be little fudges and glitches in it. Her view is, well, no, since all thoughts are pictures, all thoughts are really imperfect, and they're not perfectly abstract. And even when we do math and geometry, when we're doing geometry and we're thinking a straight line, we're just thinking a line that's pretty much straight, but it's a kind of picture before our thought. When we're doing math and we're thinking the number 5, we're thinking the sort of the figure that we draw on paper, the 5 or the Roman numeral 5, but we're thinking some version of it that's imagined before our mind. No matter how abstract our thought gets, she says, this is in the next passage in Philosophical and Physical Opinions, she says, we're still thinking of something that has a figurative ground. And maybe we're just not seeing the boundaries very clearly. Maybe we're seeing the thought in a hazy kind of cloudy way, but still it's a physical image or a picture. Okay, so then she gives a nice metaphor here of her brain being a kind of stage for thoughts, because she's going to go on, of course, to write lots of fiction and fancies, and these are going to involve the use of the imagination. And part of what Cavendish wants to say is that when we tell an imaginary story and use our imagination to tell a story, we're really picturing scenes and we're picturing figures that are material objects that are before our mind. Because matter is alive and sentient, she thinks at its most basic level, the pictures that we have before our mind when we imagine stories are going to be pictures made of bodies that are alive and animated. And so in this scene, she talks about her brain as a stage. She says, for all the time my plays are making, or my brain the stage, my thoughts were acting there. The thoughts almost have a kind of agency on their own. So that's some background on her view of the metaphysics of mind. And now I just want to say a couple of things. I think we're going to go into this in more detail in Maura's discussion, and this is also in the paper that I'd sent as background. When Cavendish then talks about imaginary worlds, we can ask what they're doing, right? Well, one thing imaginary worlds are doing for her, of course, is just presenting us with pictures, because that's what ideas are, and stories that are made up out of bodies that are doing a lot of their own creative work in the story. But Cavendish is thinking that imaginary worlds also serve another kind of function. She says, fancy is the ground whereon poetical airy castles are built. There's no such sweet and pleasing companion as fancy in a poetical head. Can there be more peace and can there be more happiness than peace and plenty? Can there be more happiness than in the repose of the mind and the contemplations of thoughts? And part of her view is going to be that a way to be pleased and engaged in life is to, of course, look out at the outside world and manipulate and deal with the bodies that are out there. But she's also thinking that another way to be pleased and entertained is to turn inward and to look at our thoughts and engage in imagination and poetical fancy. And these are different kinds of objects, the material objects outside of us and the ones in our mind, but they're all still material objects the same. And she's thinking there's quite a lot of pleasure that comes in these imaginative stories that we have before our thought. Just like we might not like our real life that much at a given stretch, and we want to get back to a book that we've been enjoying. Cavendish is thinking that fancies can provide that kind of comfort. Part of what I also try to argue, and this is more in the paper, is just that what Cavendish is doing in these imaginary worlds that she creates is creating alternate material worlds that are very different from the ones that confront us in real life. They're alternate material worlds that present us with a different picture of how things might be, not just so that we can enjoy that different picture when it's more fun and more interesting, but also to in a way, tell us about the sinews and joints of our own world, right? The world that's right in front of us. A really nice way to do that, to tell us about the real world, is not to picture the world as it actually is. We already know that, but to draw and construct and imagine alternate worlds that, by contrast, show us how our world is different. In particular, that tells us about the structural features of our world and how, for example, individuals in our world who are blocked from certain activities, like a woman being an architect or a military strategist, the reason they're blocked from those activities is because the world prohibits them. But in an alternate world that we can imagine and construct, we can imagine different structures and features where women can do that stuff and perhaps where men can't, because the supports for men are absent. So I think I'll stop here and we'll just move on to the discussion after Maura's paper.
So Maura Smyth is associate professor, sorry, I didn't update this slide, associate professor of literature and liberal arts at Mass Art. You probably know her from her book, Women Writing Fancy, Authorship and Autonomy from 1611 to 1812, Palgrave Press, that's 2017. And what she's thinking about in that book is how fancy in the 17th and 18th centuries, which is often, as we talked about, figured as trivial, ephemeral, feminine, and therefore flighty, inconstant, immaterial, is actually an overlooked form of creative agency, and that it can be especially useful to women. So her book follows the traces of fancy as they extend into the 19th and 20th century. And a lot of what it's doing is recovering fancy's past kind of before it becomes this big romantic creative genius of the individual poet that's typically male, and thinking about what its female origins are. And at the moment, speaking of fiction and fantasy, she's working on her first novel, which is loosely based on The Tempest. So she's a creative person herself. And again, there's more, but I won't say more. Instead, I will hand you the floor, and I'm excited to hear what you have for us.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Sorry, so just take a second. Does that show up?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie. And thank you, David. I loved hearing these talks. And I was just like making wild amounts of notes. So there's so many points of connection. I felt very Cavendishian to be jotting down all my lateral thoughts. So today I'm going to be talking about, as the title implies, theorizing how Cavendish is thinking about fancy and imagination, and in particular fiction, which is its endpoint. Particularly by the time she gets to the Blazing World. So we've had these in the last two talks, seen all the ways that she thinks about, in the variety of ways she thinks about fancy throughout her career, and obviously has a very clear sense that she needs to define her own kind of creativity, her own kind of creative agency in her world, beyond the ones that are already available to her in her culture. But I think she goes through a lot of different iterations of this. So one of the things I was interested in is, in talking about today, is when by the time she gets to Blazing World, which is, near the end of her creative output, relatively near the end of her life, I think she kind of comes up with or lands on a pretty, a more kind of coherent and consolidated theory of what fancy is. So I want to kind of trace that through. And this led me to choose these segments that I pulled out from the Blazing World, where in the prefatory materials and then the epilogue, you can see her really theorizing fancy, like offering it as a theory, as a tool of how to make new worlds, create fictions, and to her readers. And then in the segment I pulled from the Blazing World, in one sense, the whole Blazing World is an example of this, is that theory put into action. But the segment that I pulled, you can actually see the process of like how one might actually employ her theory and put it into action. And you, across several pages, as the Duchess is trying on different thoughts or patterns of the world, you can kind of see that theory play out. So really interested in the interplay between the theory and the practice in those sections, which is of course something she's doing throughout her writings. But again, I think there's something very mature and it's kind of matured and evolved to the point where she's describing it in Blazing World. So today I'm going to answer those two questions that Sophie put out, or attempt to answer them, that Sophie laid out at the beginning. What is fancy, especially in the Blazing World, the context of the Blazing World, and then also what can it do? What can fancy and fiction, its primary product, do? And David also touched on this as well. So I will try not to belabor any of the points that echo theirs, and just kind of move quickly through these. But to go through the outline, so what is fancy? It is, as David already told us, and I'll go through, I'm just going to go through the outline, then I'll delve into each one of these. A material part of the mind that is autonomous and driven by its own pleasure in order to make fictions. And then what can it do? What can fancy and fiction do is create new knowledge and new ways of knowing things about the world, how it works, how it might work. And David touched on this at the end of his talk. But I'm going to delve into some concrete examples that I think she gives in the text of the Blazing World, of ideas she has about how the world might work differently. So new structures of government, and this is the one I'm going to probably spend the most time on, new worlds, very obviously, and new literary forms. And she's very interested in the way that these fictions that spring from her creating fancy, as her husband William Cavendish calls it in that prefatory poem he writes for her, how they can make the world work differently. Okay. So first, it's a material part of her mind. And so David really covered this ground beautifully and brilliantly. Her fancy is material, as are its thoughts and ideas. And this is that kind of radical premise of her work, meaning that and that means that, of course, her fancy and its thoughts and ideas have their own ability to move in the world. And so what I'm interested in here, what I'm interested in this talk is how in the Blazing World, and through this theory of fancy and fiction that she lays out, Cavendish is really trying to understand some of the more radical implications especially political and literary implications of this fact, and perhaps even kind of test its limits. So what does it mean if her blazing world and her philosophical world, if both of these texts are themselves material, composed of the same rational parts of matter that make up the world? What are the implications of that? The second feature of her, or maybe second and third, is a feature of her fancy, or her theory of fancy, is that it's autonomous and driven by its own pleasure. This you can see in these quotes here, even early on in poems and fancies, there's this sense that fancy has its own choice, that's moving on its own, and that is really elaborated. I mean, it's still consistently there here, but you know, she says fancy creates of its own accord whatsoever it pleases, and delights in its own work. By fancy, I mean a voluntary creation or production of the mind. And there you get that again, that voluntariness, that choice, but you also get a lot of pleasure and a lot of delight. And a lot of self-pleasure. And there you can certainly hear resonances of the vanity that Sophie touched on, that is associated with women, right? I loved the way, Sophie, when you said that the more artificial these elements become, the more natural they are to women, right? There's this sense that women are just, and she really picks up on this and does a lot with it in her writings, the vanity of women and the kind of it's not usually a good thing in her world, but she turns it into an advantage here, even if she's not pointing that out directly right here, that it's particularly female. So it's autonomous. Another thing to point out here is that she is, the way she describes fancy here is creating of its own accord and having this voluntary production. There's a sense of it being kind of this unfettered capacity. It can move, it is a material part of her mind, as David elaborated, but it can move where it wants to, or it theoretically can move where it wants to. And this is in contrast to reason, which in the epilogue, sorry, not epilogue, the To the Reader, she describes reason. I don't have this quote here, but it's in the segment I gave you. She describes a reason as pursuing truth. And so there's a sense of reason as having this kind of internal GPS, that it is just, or, you know, it's always headed in one direction. And if it ever goes down a path that's not truth, you know, it's gonna get wrenched back onto the path it should be on. Whereas fancy has no such internal compass. There's nothing here except its own pleasure. I mean, I suppose if fancy gets bored by the world it's creating, it would move on to something else, but that's its limit, is its own pleasure. Certainly not anything external to it, like reason has. And so, you know, this is a very kind of powerful, I think, and really radical view of a capacity, a material part of the mind that is kind of here implicitly and elsewhere, I think, pretty explicitly feminized. But she, of all people, knows that there are that kind of unfettered, limitless movement is in itself, you know, a kind of imaginary. That there are always going to be obstacles that get in the way of moving. Of moving fancy from the imaginary worlds where it's material to the external actual world, you know, which is also material. So how do you get, how do you allow fancy to have that unfettered motion? How do you allow it to actually move from the mind and go out into the world? And this was a question that she thought about a lot, because she ran into, as we all know, a lot of obstacles. I really love this quote, the third quote here, where she says, "The fancies of others drive the fancies out of our own brains, as troublesome guests that fill up all the rooms of the house. Truly I am, as all the world is, partial to desire that my own fancies and opinions might live in the world, rather the fancies and opinions of other men in my brain." And there you can really see what at first the hour is women, right? Because it's men who are filling up the space of the mind with their ideas. And I find this like such a poignant and powerful image, because this idea of women, of women's minds getting like the space of their minds being crammed full of all these ideas from men in order to prevent their own ideas from participating in the actual world, is a really, I think, it's always stuck with me. And you know, she very much wants to send her ideas out. You see this, you know, also just as a total side note, but this image here of like the it's almost like a suffocation that's happening in her mind, this kind of crowding out. And I just, there's the very famous quote that Virginia Woolf has about Cavendish suffocating other women. And I just always found that so ironic that, you know, it's here, she's like hyper aware of that suffocation, and that she would get accused of that is has always been a little sad to me. But at any rate, you get, so there's this imagery that I think is dramatized in that segment, in the section that I included, where the Duchess of Newcastle, in the character, is trying on all of those different patterns of the world, is putting on, you know, Pythagoras and Epicurus, and Descartes' ideas leave her dizzy. Hobbes' ideas, like she says, it squeezes her brain together so much that it causes like this migraine that lasts for days. And so you can kind of really see the physical impact of this process, of the way that the way that all the obstacles that are put up that prevent her fancy, her fancies, you know, the fancy from kind of moving into the world, all those roadblocks have this, are dramatized here. You can see the kind of physical pain that it causes her. And so one of the questions here is, I think, you know, she's asking is in that scene and elsewhere in her writings, is like, what do you do when the existing patterns of the world don't work for you? What do you do if they actually harm you, if they hurt you? And, you know, I think her answer here is you make new ones, and you do that through fiction. You make fictions. And that is the point of fancy. This is what fancy does. So here, you know, oh, sorry. Oops. So here you, in the second quote here, fictions are an issue of man's fancy, framed in his own mind, according as he pleases, without regard whether the thing he fancies be really existent without his mind or not. You get that, again, that sense of the self-pleasure, of fancy self-pleasure, like there's, you know, whatever the fancies are that they, whatever fictions fancy imagines, once they're produced, fancy itself moves on. It's like, all right, great, I did it, I love it, now I'm gonna go make another one. But we of course know that Cavendish was very invested in, did care whether it had an existence outside of her mind. She very much wanted her fictions too. Let's see, the other thing I want to point out here in terms of how she's thinking about fiction is that she very much understands that the world that she inhabits, with all of its patterns that we see her trying on, or the Duchess trying on in that scene, contain fiction within them, even if they also contain fact. And so, you know, there's this is most clear or one example of this critique, and there's been a lot of amazing scholarly work around this this point. But you know, when she critiques Hooke's Micrographia and says like, that's just like bad art, you know, like it's not like his fancy is there on the page as he's drawing these. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact quote there, but when he's drawing his images. So she's very aware that fancy, other people's fancies are already out there in the world, and they have taken on authority and explanatory power, and people take them as truth. And there's this, even though she recognizes that it's actually a blend, right? It's both, you know, that people are filling in. So she has this great line here in Observations upon Experimental Philosophy. She says, nature being material and consequently divisible, Her parts have but divided knowledges, and none can claim a universal infinite knowledge. So there's this image here of like knowledge, all the things that we know, and then all the spaces in between them. And that's what other people have already been filling in, those spaces with their own fictions. And so I think her question is, well, why not mine, right? Why can't I be out there filling, and you take my fictions also as, and give them authority and power. And she, I think, thinks of fancy with its, and I go back to the gnat and the fairy, like it's something that can kind of, in its kind of smallness or its capacity to be small, it can flit about. And this is an attribute that fancy, that's often applied to fancy during this time, during the 17th and 18th centuries, but especially like the latter half of the 17th century, where it gets figured as this thing that's like endlessly mobile and like can flit about and move about. And so that idea that it can assume different perspectives all over the world, or in filling in these pieces in between the divided knowledges with its own fictions. So she's thinking, fancy is particularly suited to this. She sees other people doing it already, and she wants in on the game, and she wants her fictions to also be given the status of that some of them have, and to be taken seriously. So this gets us to like what can fancy and fiction do, so he in Cavendish's poem, introductory poem, he says at one point, I'm sorry I don't have the quote here, but he describes her blazing world as enlightening all. And so there's this idea, and her blazing world, of course, is tethered to her creating fancy. And so there's this idea that this blazing world can actually, it has knowledge to impart. It has something to teach us, ways of knowing about the world, things about the world, what is already the case in the world, and what is possible based on what she's imagining. And so to go into one of these, she's very, of course, very interested. So she's interested in kind of thinking about other structures of government, especially because she has no, and maybe I shouldn't say other structures of government so much as other structures of monarchy. I'll think about that. But yeah, so she has no opportunity, as we know, to assume to become king or queen herself. And so, but of course she announces that she is in this famous line from To the Reader. Though I cannot be Henry V or Charles II, yet I will endeavor to be Margaret I. And in doing that, she's, and she says later, I can't conquer lands, and I don't have the opportunity to inherit a title. So she's coming up with a new pattern of how someone could be monarch. She's just choosing to be one and making up her own world. But in this second quote, I think there's even, she's doing something that's even a little more complicated and a little more interesting. So she has here in this quote, and this is from the epilogue. Oh, sorry. Instead of the figures of Alexander, Caesar, Hector, Achilles, Nestor, Ulysses, Helen, etc., I choose rather the figure of honest Margaret Newcastle, which now I would not change for all this terrestrial world. Notice there that she, in her list of figures, Alexander, Caesar, Hector, Achilles, Nestor, Ulysses, Helen, it's a blend between fictional characters and real figures. So she's pointing out, I think, that Ulysses and Helen and Achilles have had as much impact and have left their mark on history and have impacted and shaped how people rule, how they wage war, what they consider what society considers to be heroic, and so many other aspects of her world. And so this is one of the ways she's pointing out, like, they're right up there with Caesar and Alexander, right? They are as real in a very real sense as them. They have shaped the world and have material impacts on the world. And then she puts herself among them, which is very bold and awesome. So she's right up there among them. And then she goes on to say, and if any should like the world I have made and be willing to be my subjects, They may imagine themselves such, and they are such. I mean, in their minds, fancies, and imaginations. I always like to remember here that she writes this, 6 years after the crown has been restored. There, in the previous decade, England threw out the monarchy altogether. Like the status of the monarchy is still very fraught, very much in question at the time she's writing. And I mean, of course, her life itself is defined by living in exile and being associated with the court of King Henry. So it's I think a very radical thing here. And you can almost imagine, like, at the end when she says, I mean, in their minds, fancies or imaginations, this sense of like, oh no, Charles, I'm not trying to steal your subjects, right? But also at the same time, she has gone to great lengths to show us how impactful and real she thinks fiction is. And so, she's almost putting her readers in this position of potentially having divided loyalties, right? Of being her subject and King Charles subjects, and what happens if they have to choose? I mean, this is like this is where it's interesting to think about that. Like, what is the relationship between the imagined and actual worlds, or her imaginary realm and the actual one? But there are radical implications here for the monarchy. And then even more so when she says, but if they cannot endure to be subjects, they may create worlds of their own and govern themselves as they please. She's almost here saying, if somebody doesn't want to be your subject, they don't have to be, which again, really radical implications for what it means to have a lived, if this were an idea that were to cross over into the actual world. And she's putting it out there. That this notion that one might be able to self-govern and not actually, and decide they don't want to be somebody's subject, not just hers, but maybe somebody else's, maybe Charles's. So I think there's really, she's doing really, really interesting and pretty radical things here. I'm gonna quickly wrap up here that she also obviously is creating a new world for people, but before, there's one of the poems that Sophia included in the Poems and Fancies was like The World in an Earring. And one of the things that I find really interesting about that is that if you read through it, it is like not that different from our world. It's very similar. And she just kind of goes through this thing and describes all these different elements and that mirror very much the world we live in. And of course, this is radically different. And there I'm thinking a lot about that smallness to the bigness that Sophie gestured to, that it's no longer just that there might possibly be this world, or I guess now that she's imagined it, it is there in an earring. But she's like dived into that world. And then not only is she noticing the weather and stuff, but like she is showing it to be like this wildly different world, fantastical world. And this also starts to blend into then like new genres and new literary forms, which I'll get to in a second. But she's also describing a model of interaction too, like that you can dive into these worlds that are wildly different than ours and interact with them, even governing them, and showing us what the capability of new worlds. And of course, I mean, fantasy and sci-fi, the idea of the immersive power of these worlds and being able to kind of delve into and kind of interact with these worlds is something that's kind of, something very interesting for that to think about for that genre. Let's see. So, sorry. So the final thing I just want to say, which I've kind of already touched on, is this idea of new literary forms that she is putting out there. And this is another kind of concrete impact that her fancy, insofar as it is in the world, because she's published this text, is doing and impacting the world. So she is very self-conscious about working in new literary modes. The existing forms, many of which she's tried, the treatises, poems, fiction, plays, aren't sufficient for conveying her theories and ideas. So she's attaching these two texts and asking people to read them in conjunction, or most people, to read them. I'll say something about that in a second, to read them in conjunction in a way that, you know, each reveals truths about the other. And she says, fancy, they need each other. And of course, as we know, this is often considered the first work of science fiction. So the world building she's doing here just unto itself is also a new move on the literary landscape. Final thing I'll say, I'm sorry, I really am wrapping up, is that the ways that the potential of all of these ideas that she has to move from the materiality of her mind into the world, and how they could impact them. You know, she has this epistle to all noble and worthy ladies, where she says, but by reason, most ladies take no delight in philosophical arguments. I separated some from the mentioned observations and caused them to go out by themselves, that I may express my respects in presenting to them such fancies as my contemplations did afford. And I really appreciated Liza's point over the last week that this clarifying that this epistle was attached to the Blazing World when it was published on its own in both 1666 and 1668. And then when they were published together, they had the To the Reader. So there's a way in which she's pointing out that this is very much the Blazing World, and its theory of fiction making and its theory of fancy, I think, is very much for women in particular. And, you know, it's when she says, most ladies take no delight in philosophical arguments, I don't think she's saying, this allows her to kind of point out, it's not that they don't, it's that they can't because they don't have the education. And as I think David noted, and certainly it was in your essay, in David's essay, noted all the ways in which, all the times in her writing, she points out how women are so disserviced by the society they live in, by the patriarchy they live in, and all those hurdles that go up to prevent them from learning. And so so in this sense, like for them, this is a particular tool for women. And when Blazing World was published by itself, this note went along with it to remind women that this is for you, like fancy is for you in particular. Please use it. And I also want us to think about, Witch World. And, you know, she had a sense that the time she was living in was not really her time, that she was, you know, that she might be discovered. In the two universities at the start of PPO, she writes that she sends copies of her book to Oxford and Cambridge, and she says, who knows, but she's assuming she's going to be swept under the dust or swept away, and then hoping that after her honorable burial, as at least she's there, I may have a glorious resurrection in following ages, since time brings strange and unusual things to pass. And I think here we are, right? Like talking about her work. And so many of the scholars I'm in awe of are here on this talk, or, you know, here who have brought her to the fore and helped to resurrect her. And, you know, thankfully for us, her fancy, with the help of so many of the scholars here, has wrought change on the literary canon, on our understanding of the period, and of so many different aspects of the period. So I will just end there. Thank you.
We were hoping that what we might do is start out with a little bit of sharing in terms of what the conversations were that were taking place in the individual breakout rooms. And then Arno is going to do a bit of drawing on the chat bar to share any questions that maybe haven't circulated through discussion. And then we can just open it up for anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment or draw on one of the texts that we've assigned. So is there anyone that would like to share a bit about the conversation that was taking place in their breakout room?
Yeah, we were in the midst of one with Maura, and I think Delilah was in the middle of a question that she was hoping to pose that was going to be quite unitive for the different pieces. So I was going to give her back the microphone so she could wrap up that question, if that's okay. Yeah,
by all means, Delilah, please.
Well, I wish we had more time in the breakout room, actually, so because I don't think Maura had an opportunity to fully respond. What I was most interested in the sense of the fancy having a material substance, a materiality to it. It's something I've run into in her works as well. But for me, I was really trying to see the comparison between whether it's material as in real, material as in present in our lives, or real as in reality. So whether imagination and reality and materiality and sort of, and how those working. In other words, just because it has a material presence doesn't mean that it's real. You know what I mean? So the idea between imagination and reality. Go, Maura, please.
Gosh, it's a huge question. And I actually would love to hear other people's take as well. I mean, my initial thing, I was starting to say, I think I in kind of speaking a bit off the cuff, I halfway through, I was like, is real the right word here? But you know, this idea of, and I think Christina, forgetting, somebody I was talking about that put the phrase like the real effects, or the effects fiction can have in the real world. And that's something that's a question I love the way, was that Christine? I'm sorry, or who was that who said it that way?
I think it was Jackie.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry, Jackie. But I love, yeah, so that idea of, I think what's useful for me here is thinking about the distinction between the imaginary realm, which is material, and then the actual world. And the idea that what takes place in what is imagined in that imaginary realm does have a substance to it, does exist. I mean, David did a brilliant job of laying that out, does exist. But it's just whether it gets to ever be viewed or experienced by anyone else, and in what form. So in Cavendish's case, I think she's very interested in writing, and in putting her ideas down, and sending them out into the world through the publication process. And it's that publication process that makes them real and tangible for other people. There's the words on the page, but there's also the way that those ideas then enter into that person's mind and fill up that person's mind, hopefully. I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is the way that she, there's almost this sense in her writing of like, I've had to reckon with all of your ideas. Now I want you to reckon with mine. And I want the opportunity to send these out into the world and make you reckon with my ideas, and make them have, because just the act of reckoning inevitably changes whoever's doing the reckoning, even if it's to drive them more into their position. That reckoning is a way of impressing on the world and shaping the world itself. And so for me, like the big hurdle for her is kind of getting over any obstacles between the imaginary and the actual. And then the reality that they take is dependent, I think, upon that reckoning and upon that interaction, that whoever the reader is, what's the form in which they're engaging with it. I mean, Delilah, you were saying, sorry, now I'm messing up again. Who puts on the plays? Bueno. You perform the plays, right? So that would be another medium through which to reckon with her ideas, and that might have a very different impact than, say, reading them. But that grappling that happens on the part of the viewer or the reader in whatever form or medium, and of course, again, the medium is going to also help to shape the form, the way that impresses upon reality, such as it is, can have very different, can change. And David put this really well when he said, can change or make us think differently about the structures of the world as it is. And then it can become closer to the thing that's imagined through that reckoning and interaction, once the fancies get over that hurdle, get out of the imaginary into the actual through whatever form.
Can I just jump in to say, I think a useful term here, it's one I've been working with, would be the idea of patterning, right? Because there's this question of, she wants herself, her avatars, her ideas to live on in other people's brains, right? But I don't think she thinks that like her actual brain matter is gonna like show up in E's brain, right? So the idea is that she makes a pattern, and then E's brain is gonna pattern out that same, again, pattern is like, there's a great thing going on in the chat about how fancy is both a verb and a noun, and it sort of shifts more and more towards the verbal. And I think patterning has that same shifty quality. But anyway, right, in terms of like getting it out, it's about, as Maria says, it's about motion more than it's about substance, and sort of templates. Yeah. Anyway,
I love that idea of patterning too, because there's a replication that can go with that, similar to publishing, but also it gets to garments and fashion and such. Anyway, I'll mute my.
No, that was great. And I'm glad that you used me as an example, because I was just thinking about, in terms of the patterning, I love that the discussion about creating these alternatives for women. Maura talks about this in her article, and David gets at this a little bit in his article as well. And I'll be talking a little bit next week about how Cavendish teaches through her texts with symbolic models. So I think the patterning is a very relevant issue. Do we have someone who wants to share out from David's room or Sophia's room, just in terms of what our conversations were? I know our small groups were quite short, so.
Well, I was in the room with Sophia, and so we talked about a few things. We talked about, I guess the two things I would bring up that might be of interest to the group as a whole is Cecilia brought up a question about the term opinion as it relates to fancy on the one hand and reason on the other. And one idea that came out of our discussion is how she moves in her philosophical treatises from philosophical fancies to philosophical opinions. And so that might be something we might want to talk about as a group. And then the thing we were talking about as we ended was the relationship between fancy and different literary forms and what those connections might be, particularly inspired by Sophia's initial observation of fancies as small. And some of the poems, of course, are very small. And then we ended with that great discussion of the blazing world, which is not in any way small. So those were some of the ideas that might inspire further discussion.
Thank you so much, Laura. Would anyone like to chime in, or someone from David's room, or any?
or you tell us what you're going to talk about.
Well, Lisa has something that she would like to share, so we will hand it over to Lisa. They were having a very robust discussion, so. Oh, you're on mute, Lisa.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was pushing David on epistemology and the relationship between sense and reason. And I think we also got to patterning by the end of that discussion. So the idea of thought as material. And I was asking, is there a necessary connection between what we observe and what we think? And David said correctly that we then work on those thoughts and mush them around in our brains, or at least Cavendish thought that, and come up with different kinds of ideas, which remain material, of course, because everything remains material motion. So anybody else want to add to that? I don't know what happened to David in this.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we, this is a slight segue, but possibly can we turn to Marina? Because there's a really nice point there about kind of real effects and real violence, and coupling that with sort of the fun and the pleasure and the vanity of fancy. Which,
yeah, I mean, I just wanted, you know, I think we were dipping fancy in a lot of fairy dust and that was a point of sort of shared convergence, but it is striking how I don't think that whatever she is doing in her multiverses of, say, the Blazing World, or really any of her fictions, she addresses violence, she rehearses violence, she celebrates violence, right? So I'm just a little uncomfortable when it sounds like her fancy produces these sort of compensatory worlds, these sort of, I mean, I do still see them as rehearsal spaces perhaps, but I also want to just keep that sort of active materiality to fancy, and how differently we view that when we think about the kind of, you know, the trauma Sean added to that is sort of behind that, likely for her living through civil wars, exile, and all of that, and also just wanting to truthfully represent the violence of female experience. I think in the Convent of Pleasure, where you have a little entertainment, where you have a series of women's traumas, you know, and that's obviously a fanciful exercise. It's not, you know, it's a series of meta dramas. So I guess, you know, I just would love to ask all of the speakers to kind of reflect on the difference of acknowledging violence would make to their account of fancy.
You know, so I agree with what you're highlighting. Absolutely. I think one of the reasons I think I want to say that just one of the ways that she uses fancy is to draw attention to alternate ways the world might be structured and for the better, so that folks could live identities that are more closer to home for them and not face such resistance. But I know she's doing other things with fancy as well. I think one of the reasons I focus on what I do is there's a tendency to read Cavendish as really an extreme social conservative and not interested at all in any kind of social change and just preserving her position. And I've always thought that wasn't the case. And I've been interacting with Brandy Siegfried a bit on this. She's working on a project where she wants to argue that even though Cavendish was a royalist, she was very interested in the well-being of peasants and local community members and local regions in the kingdom, and that the health of the kingdom depended on people doing well across the board. And there was a kind of activism in which she was involved, even if it's not, you know, she's not Marx or anything like that, of course, but I think a lot of progressives are not particularly active, and you know, they're more, they write, and they may not be as on the ground as we would like. I'd like to emphasize that a part of her work has a kind of activist side toward the good. But you're absolutely right. There are many other ways in which she wants to use fancy to highlight negatives. And I really liked what Sophie and Maura were highlighting, that it's not just that these fancies are in other, that reflect other worlds. Fancies are in the world right now, and they can do violence if the fancy is an ideology that a large group of people shares, and it's a false ideology, but that group of individuals has efficacy. I mean, this is how she's so relevant right now, right?
If I can jump in real quickly, I was thinking about that as well, just like all the prevalence of conspiracy theories that are shaping so much of our civic life right now, and causing so much social upheaval, causing violence, causing death. So I think this is this is such an absolutely important question. And I mean, you look at the second part of The Blazing World, and like what she does there is horrific, awful, disturbing. And you're like, this is the same mind, and this is yet another model, right? This is yet another way that this could impact the world. So I mean, all to say, I agree 100%. And I want to make sure not to be advocating for viewing all of her fancies or the products of anyone's fancies as compensatory. I think there's, like I said, there's definitely a dark side to fancy. And when I was writing my book, I got this question, and I ended up not delving too far into it because I was trying to like even kind of bring this thing to light across so many authors. But it is there, and we're seeing it right now in these kind of horrifying and disturbing ways kind of pop up. So I think that book needs to be written. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to draw attention. I don't know, Arno, if you want to chime in on some of the really fascinating things that are taking place in the chat. Liza just pointed out sort of the structure of poems and fancies and where some of the fairy poems are situated in terms of being near like the description of a battle and fight, and some of those darker, more violent poems. So kind of bringing some of that violence to life. I don't know if anyone wants to build on that, or if there's another direction that folks want to take.
Just on a matter of logistics, if you have a follow-up point that you don't get a chance to quite address in the chat, but you absolutely want to get to, the raised hand feature is a good way to catch that, because it'll stay there and I can then butt in and jump in. So we had a discussion going on about the verb figuring from Maria that kind of got lost. And then Jackie also had a kind of fantastic comment really at the start of our coming back together that might actually speak to this. And I was wondering, Jackie, if you might want to come in and reiterate that point for us all so we don't miss it. Sorry to put you on the spot. You're welcome to refuse that.
Oh, totally fine. I think when we're starting to talk about the materiality of thought, we need to be fairly clear that the term real was being used, I think, in an ever expansive way. A lot of 17th century philosophers, including some of the first experimentalists, were quite invested in making sure that their micro worlds could be considered real in the term's way that we'd use it now. Because without real micro worlds, their new philosophical methods could not be validated. So I wonder if the term real or reality is just a way of talking about materiality that is currently inaccessible to us, but could be made experienceable through new technologies like microscopic lenses. So that's one of the ways we might be able to outmaneuver some of the tensions between the notions. But that kind of moves us away from the discussion of the dark fancies and the legitimate effects of the Achilles and the Helens in the world. So I can end there and turn it back over to Maura, who I believe was kind of heading that discussion.
I would love to hear what I feel like I've been talking a lot. So if other people have thoughts too, I don't need to say anything else on that thread. I'm sure other people, and Sophie, I don't know if you were the third panelist, so if you have thoughts too, those disturbing fairies.
Well, I would say I did kind of pull them out of context. There's so much. Poems and Fancies is huge, and you really should go to Liza's edition, and it's really easy to kind of see like where it all goes and keep track of. And we will actually be looking at stuff from there for next week, so you should play around on that website and kind of read the account. But yeah, they're very much grouped thematically. And they kind of develop, but of course it's Cavendish, so there's also places where they contradict each other or she's trying out different perspectives.
I'm not sure how we're stepping in here because I was a late arrival. I'm having trouble with my technology at the moment, I'm afraid. But has anybody mentioned The Merchant of Venice yet in relation to fancy? Okay. Or while I was preparing for this seminar, the song from The Merchant of Venice, the choosing song, was running through my head constantly. When I think Cavendish goes back to Shakespeare all the time, and I'm here to advocate for the plays. She goes back to Shakespeare because William loved Shakespeare, and one of the ways that William educates her is through Shakespeare and through reading plays together. We know that because she talks about how they read plays together in the times that the theatres were closed. I think The Merchant of Venice is there in the background. Portia has the situation where she doesn't know her future. She doesn't know which of the caskets her future is contained in. And the song that's sung while the caskets are being chosen is about fancy. Tell me where is fancy bred, or in the heart, or in the head, how begot, how nourished. And I think that is a fancy reference that we need to pay attention to in relation to Cavendish, that she's sort of spreading fancy out. And she's saying, okay, guys, okay, readers, here's the deal. Fancy is a concept, it's a really big concept, it's a really important concept. Maybe it's a really important concept for women and for women's futures and for women's agency. We don't know enough about it. And personally, I don't know where to go with that. My interest is where The Merchant of Venice pops up in the plays, but I don't know whether that's a useful comment to some of you who are working on other works in relation to fancy, that she's putting a huge question mark over fancy and over its origins and its influence as well.
Yeah, does anyone have a response or a reaction to that? I will be not discussing necessarily the connection between the Merchant of Venice and Cavendish in terms of fancy, but next week I will be talking a little bit about Lady Delicia in The Contract and sort of her scene in the courtroom, which is similar to Portia's moment. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Sarah had her raised. Sarah Parker had her hand up. And
Brilliant. Thank you.
I feel like I shouldn't be speaking at all in the Cavendish thing, but I do know Merchant of Venice. And I was just thinking in that scene, that song is not for all suitors, right? The Prince of Morocco chooses the wrong casket, and then the Prince of Aragon chooses the wrong casket. So, I think, and I can't remember what, the critical apparatus that with this, to credit the reading, because it's certainly not mine, but a lot of people read that song as a hint Portia's giving Bassanio so that she gets the right suitor. So in a way, that song is a moment of a woman kind of who's been given this passive role, a dead father who still exerts power over the marital choice, and she's kind of seizing, potentially, seizing that power in order to make her own choice of a husband there.
That's why I think it's so much about agency. And I think here's Cavendish in a different country, a situation, and looking for women's agency in particular, looking for possibilities, looking for starting points. And I think fancy's one of the, and I'm sure you've said this already, and I am so fed up to have missed the beginning of the discussion. I'm sure you've said this already, that fancy is one of the big starting points.
One of the points that Gweno and Sarah's kind of discussion about agency brings up, I think that ties back to Maura's clues about fancy working on its own, creating on its own, is that Cavendish doesn't always seem to be clear about whether one uses fancy, whether it's a kind of faculty that you can click on or click off, or whether it kind of has its own volition, its own moves. There's a kind of, rather like the heart beating, that it kind of continues to do its own thing, even if I'm not actively thinking about it, that the fancy works. And within that kind of phenomenology of a kind of, you don't really control when you daydream, when you start fiction, when you stop fiction, it just kind of has its own rules and methods. To tie back to the question of violence and destruction, it's not clear that fancy also dictates a moral universe of good and bad, according to which we could say there is a dark side to fancy. It seems like the moment you're in a dream, it kind of has its own moral, something terrible could happen that doesn't necessarily constitute a good or a bad. And in the same way, a kind of fictional universe has to define its own goods and bads, whether by kind of a simulacral relationship to what we were calling earlier the real, but I think Jackie's done a good job of kind of making us aware that that category is a little expansive. But so I just wanted to kind of bring up that question, just because Maura's citations were so precise on that fancy is creating on its own. It's almost as though sometimes fancy uses us as agents rather than the other way around. It raises a question I know Steve Fallon is working on with regards also to the permeability of a fanciful world to maybe a real or a material world. So we've been having this whole debate about whether or not the imagined world is a kind of heuristic or maybe a propedeutic to a rehearsal, to use Marina's term, for another universe that we care about deeply and that has moral consequences that we know about. But it's not always clear within the Blazing World or other works how to transition from one world to the next. I ask you to unmute and check in with us a little bit on that.
Yeah, I guess I've been interested in what happens in the Blazing World in terms of materiality and immateriality. The immaterial spirits in the text also speaking to the Empress about making worlds which are themselves immaterial. And then the question of what that means, is that a relative immateriality, or is that sort of an absolute immateriality, which would be an impossibility? I think one could have impossibilities inside of a text that doesn't cause too much problems, but the text itself, which is the result of the sort of the rational animate matter of Cavendish making this world, what is the ontological status of that world? Is it subtly material? Is it immaterial? And I'm interested in the question of what happens with say, the gold in the Blazing World that Cavendish cannot import back into our world. We have these three worlds, and we can move matter from the blazing world to the world of FC, but we can't move matter to our world. So there's all kinds of layers to disentangle. If you think about what's material and what is possibly not material at all as a kind of heuristic fiction in the work.
That's really interesting. Sophia, were you going to chime in on something?
I was looking at this thing on the chat, thinking about ecosystems that lies in multiverse.
Lisa Saracen wanted to come in.
Okay, sorry.
Lisa, we can't hear you. Hold on just a sec. We're not there yet.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Okay. So I just wanted to point out that there is a material substrate to the blazing world. The young maiden comes from our world and goes into the blazing world. So there is some transposition of material being from real to imaginary.
But quickly, is she from our world or from the world of FC, which is I read it as a third world?
Do you? I read it as England, whatever.
I think it's in my reading, it's parallel to our world, but it's not the same as our world.
Okay, but whatever world she comes from, there is a material movement from that world to the blazing world. Just,
yeah,
I just put it out there.
Yeah, I guess I'm taking those as parallel in their whatever level of materiality they have, as opposed to our world.
I know Marina, and I know other people, but I can't hold them all in my brain at once, but has a nice way of explaining how you think it's our world and you're kind of supposed to, and then every time something happens, you keep getting new pieces of information that are both new information and make you realize that what you thought you knew was totally wrong. And you kind of lurch through the whole blazing world in this kind of horrible, nauseating, seasick sort of way. Those are not Marina's words, those are my words. I don't think she says seasick, but yeah, you think it is our world, and then you think the Duchess is her too. You keep thinking that you know what's going on, and you're never right.
Yeah, I think they say at one point that she definitely references a third world, but I find it so interesting because she draws on references to Ben Jonson and to John Dee and to, these historical figures. And so are there, and I think Marina was referencing the multiverse, and Delilah brought this up too. So I would love for them to chime in, definitely. But it's like there's multiple versions of our world that she's playing around with, or at least very nearly. David has his hand raised.
I just wanted to mention, Deborah Boyle has some interesting work that she's doing on this, where even though in the text, Cavendish will go on and say we can't have ideas of immaterials, and we can't think about them or communicate about them or talk about them. Deborah wants to say that well, she still thinks that God exists. And so there's got to be some sense in which there's some way that our minds can be directed at immaterials or have something to say about them, where maybe we can say they have some reality. And so I think she would see the blazing world references to immaterial spirits as perhaps a sincere expression on Cavendish's part that maybe there are immaterials and we can somehow get at them. I disagree entirely with her view, but so what? Right? She's really smart and has good things to say. But there's some reason to think that maybe Cavendish wants to try to reference or gesture at immaterials, even if strictly speaking, she thinks we can't have ideas of them.
Delilah, did you have some alternative possibilities on the third world? Not third world, but is there a third world debate?
Yeah, sorry about that. Not necessarily the third world. I mean, I've worked with it with my students before on this point related to science fiction, in the sense that it was an alternate world, of the world she traveled through the pools and went into the blazing world. And that becomes a much like science fiction does across, its history, where the alternate world becomes a sort of a patterned on our world, so it can be a critical space. So I think that after all, the Duchess does travel with the Empress to the Duchess's world, where they run into the Duke and such. So there's a real movement to this other world. It is named Esfi, so of course to suggest this sort of comparative critical space. But I've always, and students immediately see it as this alternate world, this moving across worlds like science fiction has done across time. So yeah.
And I would just add that, speaking of across time, one of the things she's refiguring in the blazing world is history, right? It's not just a kind of set of future alternatives, but she's reconfiguring Eden and paradise in the story of the fall. And so, I do think she brilliantly anticipates all sorts of space-time continuums in how she sees those, vectors converging, at any rate. Just as a thought.
Yeah,
I could just jump in and say there's one thing that I was thinking about earlier is the connection, this idea of Fancy's autonomy, that in Paradise Lost, Eve's Fancy is functioning all the time, even when she sleeps, and then that's problematic. That's one of the things that leads her to the fall, that it's kind of this uncontrollable faculty, whereas Adam's Fancy does not work that way. So it's this really, so I almost feel like she's drawing on that and being like, this isn't actually so bad, when she brings up the that trope of the Genesis story.
Yeah, everybody, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Now we are about out of time, if you can believe that. Is there anyone who would like to close? Are there some closing thoughts or comments or suggestions that anyone would like to throw in before we have to say our farewells?
Can we just do lots of applause for Sophie? When I was futzing with my camera and stuff, and we didn't do that. And that was really a terrific presentation.
Thank you, absolutely.
I was so excited to be joined by my co-panelists and also by all of you. We know that you're very tired of Zoom, and we're really, really happy that you came anyway. And Eve, do you want to just quickly remind us about next week?
Yeah, I am, like you said, incredibly excited to be presenting with two of the just smartest resource folks in the Cavendish world. So I will be presenting a little bit on Cavendish as an educational theorist, or I might even venture the word pedagogue. We'll talk about that next week. But then Sarah Connell is going to be talking to us about the Women Writers Project, and Liza Blake is going to be telling us all about her digital critical edition of Poems and Fancies. So there's going to be all kinds of wonderful information to look forward to for next week. All right, thank you guys so much. We will see you next week, and stay safe and healthy.